Uh, so you realize that in these structures, we have the receptors that are located on the sense organs. Then there are clusters of neurons involved, that is the sensory, the relay, and the motor. And then a component of the nervous system, which is the spinal cord. You can be able to see the spinal cord in this region. So having the nerve cells that are distributed within the gray matter, and those that are passing through the white matter. And then the last segment of this reflex action is the effectors. So that means that a simple reflex action has three main component structures. Number one, the receptors. Number two, the central nervous system, that is mainly the spinal cord. And then the last one is the effector. Now, the spinal cord here acts as a mediator, that is for the conduction of an impulse between the sensory nerve cell and the motor nerve cell, of course through the relay neuron. And this is why we said, when we were discussing the roles of the spinal cord, we said that it coordinates reflex action, as it is seen here. So the effectors contracts, bringing about a movement. The movement is the one that enables the part of the body to be withdrawn or to be removed away from a stimulus which is injurious, like for example in this case pricking objects. So there are many other examples that you can be able to use to illustrate simple reflex action. I think I will quickly look through the knee-jerk experiment. The knee-jerk experiment. The knee-jerk experiment. The knee-jerk experiment. Minutes.
Go.
Yeah, here it is. So in this part, if you take your leg and you fold one above the other, then you leave one of the leg to be hanging, then you can be able to carry out a knee-jerk experiment. Now, during this experiment, one person can be a volunteer and another one can be the experimenter. So if one knocks hard on the knee patella at this point where the cursor is, where we have the patellar ligament, so the sense receptor cells, which we call the straight receptors, will be able to pick up the impulse. Remember, the stimulus here is some pain, some form of pain. Then the impulse will be created. The impulse, once created, it will be transmitted or conducted via a sensory neuron all the way into the gray matter of the spinal cord. And within the spinal cord, the information will be integrated in that it will be transferred, or not transferred really, but transmitted or conducted from the sensory neuron and then relayed to the motor neuron across or along the synapse. Remember, synapse are points at which the adjacent nerve fibers, especially their dendrons or dendrites, meet. But remember, they do not contact. They just form a gap. So that gap is the one that we refer to as a synapse. Sometimes we can call it a neural junction. And the type of the synapse here, we can say it is two. A synapse between adjacent neurons, we call that neuron to neuron synapse. That is a synapse between two adjacent or three adjacent neurons. That is called neuron to neuron synapse. So the impulse will be delivered onto the motor neuron. Then the motor neuron is connected to the muscles. So these muscles will be able to be excited. Once they are excited, they contract. When they contract, the leg will be pulled away, but remember, this activity is instantaneous. It is instant. At that time, the response is exhibited. The brain is not involved. So that's why sometimes we have some other neurons that emanate from the spinal cord all the way to the brain. Such a neuron, we call it connector neuron. It emerges from the spinal cord all the way to the brain, where the structures for mediation or interpretation of the stimulus are located. In this case, the stimulus being pain. So that's why sometime after the response has been seen, that's when the brain processes the information that the structure or whatever that the body came into contact with was either painful, was hot, or there is some pressure, there's some light. That occurs some fractions after the activity or the response has been brought about for simple reflex action. So there are many other examples that you can use to demonstrate the reflex action, but I think the two are enough. So let's look at the other type of reflex action, which is conditioned reflex action. Conditioned reflex action. So in conditioned reflex action, it is an automatic response which can be evoked or brought about from an animal by unrelated stimulus. Underline the word unrelated. Substituted for one which normally causes the response. And the experiment was done to show this, and it was done by a Russian scientist whom we call Ivan Pavlov in 1902, using the dogs. In his experiment, which he termed as classical conditioning, he used a dog to demonstrate this aspect of conditioning. So, how did he do his experiment? In one instance, he used to feed the dog with food. Remember, at the time of bringing the food, the dog would salivate. This is a normal reflex action, and therefore it is normally expected that when the dogs see food, they salivate. Now, he decided to carry out a repeated activity, that is continued providing food to the dog, and anytime he provided the food, the dog did salivate. Now, he decided to bring in another stimulus, but at this time round, they were brought simultaneously. That is, when bringing the food to the dog, he could ring a bell. And therefore, such an experiment, we call it ringing bell experiment for classical conditioning by Ivan Pavlov. So anytime he could bring the food, he could ring the bell. Now, he continued this for several days or even weeks, and therefore the dog learned to associate bell ringing with the food. So later on, he decided to substitute one stimulus. Remember, there were two. One that normally elicits a response, which is salivation, and this is food, or the taste of food, or the sight of food. And then the other one, which is ringing the bell, which in this case we call unrelated or secondary stimulus. So when he went on ringing the bell without bringing the food, the dog continued to salivate. So what do we learn from this? It is that the primary stimulus was replaced by a different and unrelated stimulus, which is ringing the bell, of course, through learning. So we realize that conditioned reflex usually weakens with the time, and therefore it must be reinforced by repeated stimulus. So if he continued ringing the bell without having the food, there was no salivation by the dog, because with the time the action had weakened, and therefore this forms the basis of learned behavior. We have to do some activities again and again to condition ourselves with them. Otherwise, with the time, we lose them. For example, learning. Now, what are other examples of conditioned reflexes? Number one, here we have groups that have classified as motor skills, that is including walking, playing, cycling, writing, swimming, driving. Remember all these without training, it is difficult to do them for the first time. Therefore, learning is involved, and ultimately that learning becomes, if it is continuously done, one gains experience. Then the other example is the everyday practical applications, including the training of dogs, as was done by Ivan Pavlov, and then why we go to school, of course, learning process. So with the time, if you stop learning today, whatever you've learned, whatever your memory has set, whatever your memory has stored, with the time it weakens and you end up forgetting. That's why it must be done time and again. Now finally, I want us to look at the difference between the two types of reflex action, simple and conditioned. Can be illustrated in the table here. Difference number one, in simple reflex action, a single stimulus brings about the response, and this response does not change. A single stimulus brings about a response. For example, a pain in part of the finger will always bring the same response, which is contraction of the muscles, the bicep muscles, that leads to pulling off of the finger away from the stimulus or a sharp object or hot object, if that is the case. Whereas in conditioned reflex, a repeated stimulus brings about the response. For example, Ivan Pavlov continuously gave the food to the dog, and therefore the dog responded by salivating. Difference number two, it's a simple form of behavior and independent of learning or experience. But in conditioned reflex, it actually involves modification of behavior depending on experience. Number 3, which is the last one, sensory and motor components are the same at all times. That is, sensory neuron, motor neurons are all the same because they are the ones that pick the same type of impulse and brings about the same type of response for the sensory and the motor neurons respectively. And lastly, the primary and sensory components are replaced by a secondary component, but the motor remains the same. But the motor component remains the same. So those are the differences between a conditioned and simple reflex action. Take time, read through them, and understand, because this is an area that can be examined in your exams. So, thank you.